Welcome to Gaia's Calling, where stories ignite your spirit and the earth whispers her secrets. I'm Brad Swift, a write-on-purpose author of eco-fiction and non-fiction, inviting you to become an eco-guardian. Together, let's explore the wonders of our world and take action to protect them. Listen closely. Gaia is calling. And welcome to Gaia's Call, where today we're going to explore why people actually change, the surprising science of motivation and how it applies to our relationship with Earth. And this is part 2 of this Changing the Story, Changing the Future series. So let's dig in. In part 1 of this series, we explored something deceptively simple but profoundly important. Much of our suffering and much of our paralysis in the face of global challenges comes not from the events themselves, but from the interpretations we attach to them. If the story running in our minds says the future is doomed, or some similar disempowering story, the most likely result is, despair. If the story says nothing we do matters, the most likely result is no results, inaction. These results, these stories we carry around as though they are true, quietly shape and limit the possibilities we see. But changing the story in our minds is only the first step. The next question is just as important and perhaps even more challenging. How do we actually change our behavior? And by the way, if you're reading or listening to this, you can actually share it as a public post from the website at Substack. If we're honest, most of us already know that we should be doing in many areas of our life. We know we should eat better, move our bodies more often, spend less time staring at screens, and perhaps spend more time caring for the natural world that sustains us. Yet, knowing what we should do and actually doing it are often two very different things. Information alone rarely changes behavior. If it did, the internet would have already solved most of humanity's problems. Parenthetically, yes, some might say such a wealth of information has only served to make matters worse, but that's a discussion we'll save for another day. For many years, I assumed that motivating people, including myself, worked in a fairly straightforward way. You explain the problem clearly, you explain why it matters, and then you encourage people to do the right thing. In other words, we tell people what they should do, and then we try to persuade them that it's important. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the tell and sell approach. Sounds reasonable enough, but research suggests that it rarely works as well as we think. In fact, something interesting more often happens when people are told what they must do. Instead of becoming motivated, they become resistant. There is a well-documented psychological phenomenon called psychological reactance, which describes our deeply human tendency to push back when we feel our autonomy is threatened. The harder someone insists that we adopt a certain behavior, the more our inner sense of independence starts to protest. Even if we might have agreed with the suggestion originally, the feeling of being pushed can make us want to do the opposite. Anyone who has raised children or remembers being a child recognizes this dynamic immediately. Tell a person that they absolutely must clean their room right now, and suddenly cleaning their room becomes the last thing they want to do. Adults are not so different. Study after study has shown that people often avoid actions they are strongly told to take, even when those actions align with their own interest. This insight sits at the very heart of a fascinating motivational approach developed by Yale researcher Michael Padalon, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, in his work on instant influence. His research suggests that people are far more likely to change when they hear themselves say why they want to change. In other words, lasting motivation rarely comes from someone else's arguments. It arises when individuals connect with their own reasons for taking action. The practical implication of this insight is surprisingly simple and yet powerful. Instead of asking someone why they should change, ask them why they might want to change. This small shift from should to might can make a remarkable difference. It lowers resistance and respects autonomy. Rather than triggering defensiveness, it invites curiosity and reflection. And yes, I'd love for you to join the chat about this here on the website at Substack. From there, a short sequence of questions can help people uncover their own motivations. One might begin by asking, why might you want to make this change? The next question explores readiness. In other words, on a scale from 1 to 10, how ready do you feel you are to try this? Then comes a clever twist. Why didn't you choose a lower number? You see, that question nudges the mind towards the reasons change already matters. From there, the conversation moves forward towards imagining the positive outcomes of change, exploring why those outcomes are meaningful, and finally identifying one small next step. Notice what is happening in this process. No one is being lectured. No one is being pushed. Instead, people are discovering their own motivations. And once those motivations begin to take shape, action often follows naturally. When I first encountered this research, something clicked immediately in relationship to the climate crisis and the broader polycrisis we are navigating today. For decades, much of the environmental conversation has relied heavily on the tell and sell approach. Scientists present alarming data. Advocates explain why change is necessary. Leaders urge people to adopt more sustainable behaviors. While these efforts are often well-intentioned and factually correct, they can sometimes trigger the very resistance psychological research predicts. If psychological reactance is real, and the evidence suggests it is, then some of our attempts to motivate environmental action may unintentionally produce the opposite result. People do not want to feel pushed or shamed into caring for the planet. They want to feel that their actions arise from their own values and their own sense of meaning. For example, given that my background and training as a veterinarian was science-based, it felt natural to talk about and seek out the facts about climate change. But I found that data did little to motivate me or others into action. It wasn't until Logan and later Piper, my two grandkids, who are now 5 and 3, when they came along, that I realized it was time for me to take action to forward the process of creating a regenerative future that would leave them with a planet they would be proud to call their own. So, what do you deeply care about that might inspire you into action to join the ranks of being an eco-guardian in training? Why not leave a comment below? Of course, you need to be on the app or on the Substack website to do so. This insight suggests a different kind of conversation about the Earth. Instead of telling people what they must do to save the planet, we might begin with a much simpler and more human question. Why might protecting the natural world matter to you? For one person, the answer might involve their children or grandchildren, as it did for me. For another, it might be the beauty of a nearby forest or river. For someone else, it may be the simple desire to live a meaningful life that contributes to something larger than oneself. Whatever the answer turns out to be, the motivation then becomes personal, and personal motivations are powerful. I was reminded of this recently during a conversation with a friend about the state of the world. We talked about the climate disruption, political tensions, and the growing sense that many of our systems are under strain. At one point, my friend shrugged and said something I hear fairly often these days. Honestly, it feels like there's nothing ordinary people can do. In the past, I might have responded by offering examples of practical actions, reducing consumption, supporting regenerative agriculture, planting trees, or restoring local ecosystems. Instead, I tried a different approach. I simply asked, what do you care most about protecting in the world? He paused for a moment, thinking. Then he began telling me about a river where he used to fish with his father when he was a boy. That river, it turned out, held some of his most cherished memories. As he spoke, the entire tone of the conversation shifted. We were no longer discussing abstract environmental problems. We were talking about something he loved. From there, it became much easier to imagine what kind of actions might help protect places like that river. The motivation didn't come from my arguments, it came from his memories and his sense of connection. This approach aligns beautifully with the deeper philosophy behind the One Cause Project. The great untruths of modern culture have encouraged us to see the earth primarily as a backdrop for human activity, or even a warehouse of resources to extract. The four great truths invite a different perspective, that life is interconnected, that sufficiency is possible, that reciprocity with nature sustains abundance, and that humanity's role as stewardship rather than domination. Those truths cannot simply be imposed through arguments or ideology. They have to be rediscovered through experience and relationship. When someone reconnects with a river they love, a forest they remember, a garden they tend, or a piece of land they care for, those truths often begin to reveal themselves naturally. If you're curious to experiment with this idea yourself, try something simple this week. Choose one small action that might support life in some way, something practical and manageable. Perhaps it involves planting a tree or reducing waste, supporting a local farmer, restoring soil in your garden, or spending time tending a small piece of land. Then ask yourself a few gentle questions. Why might I want to do this? On a scale of 1 to 10, how ready am I to try? And why didn't I choose a lower number? Imagine I did this, what positive outcome might result? And why are those outcomes important to me? And what might be the smallest next step I could take? Notice that none of these questions force action. They simply invite reflection. Yet once our own reasons become visible, action often begins to feel less as an obligation and more like a natural expression of who we are. In the final article of this series, we'll bring these two insights together. Changing the story in our minds opens the door to possibility. Discovering our own motivations ignites action. Together, they can help us become something Buckminster Fuller once described with a beautiful metaphor. Trim tabs, small forces capable of helping turn much larger systems. And in a time of planetary transition, the world may need many trim tabs. And here's a P.S. A new ecosystem and a new conversation. By the time this episode airs, Ann and I will be with Logan and Piper for a much-needed and deeply earned family beach trip. It will be their first time experiencing an entirely new ecosystem in such an immersive way. The rhythms of the ocean, the pull of the tides, the vastness of something both playful and powerful. I have a feeling we'll all be learning something. And shortly after we return, on Friday, May 29th, a new episode of Gaia's Call 2.0 will go live. One that feels like a natural continuation of everything we've been exploring together in this series, and one I'm really excited about. Marla of the Eco Chapter and I will be joined by Manda Scott, host of the Accidental Gods podcast, for a conversation that goes right to the heart of this moment. Number one, why are we in this mess? And two, what role do our deepest fears and cultural patterns play? Also, number three, what can one person actually do? And our fourth topic, perhaps most importantly, what role does creativity play in shaping what comes next? Manda speaks powerfully about what she calls the imagination revolution, the idea that creativity isn't optional in times like these. It's essential. It may, in fact, be the leading edge of change. And as I watch Logan and Piper encounter the ocean for the first time, I'll be reminded that imagination begins exactly there, in wonder, in relationship, and in direct experience with the living world. So, be one of the first to hear this powerful conversation on imagination, creativity, and the future we're shaping together. Subscribe today. Take care.